If it's Wednesday, President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping are meeting in a rare face-to-face summit right now as the two world leaders try to turn down the temperature amid multiple foreign wars and a global fight for influence. Plus, the Israeli military conducts what it's calling a targeted operation against Hamas at Gaza City's main hospital after the U.S. confirms it has intelligence that the hospital is being used as a command and control center, all while a humanitarian crisis rages on. And Senator Manchin speaks out. The West Virginia Democrat sits down with our own Kristen Welker for a wide-ranging interview on a potential run for president, third-party threats, and the future of the president and his party. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake reporting in Washington on a critical day for the White House. Right now, President Biden is meeting with Chinese President Xi at a high-stakes summit in California as the two leaders seek to stabilize rising tensions economically and militarily. We'll have much more on that meeting and what we heard from both leaders this afternoon. But we begin with breaking news on the Israel-Hamas war as the Israeli military confirms it's conducting a, quote, targeting operation against Hamas inside the beleaguered Al-Shifa hospital complex, the largest in the Gaza Strip, raising fears for patients and staff still trapped in the medical facility. Israel says it entered the Al-Shifa complex early this morning, and the military has released this video of an IDF spokesman walking through a building in the complex. Israeli officials say they killed, a number of Hamas members as they entered the hospital complex, and they say they found evidence of a Hamas command center, including military equipment. NBC is unable to independently verify those claims or what was found in the hospital. We'll speak with an IDF official in just a moment. Israeli forces also released footage of its soldiers apparently in the Al-Shifa courtyard, carrying boxes of medical supplies. The director of the hospitals in the Gaza Strip confirmed Israel's presence, saying 650 patients, along with 400 medical staff and 200 displaced Gazans, remain in the hospital. And the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry released video of what they say is inside the besieged medical complex, appearing to show doctors moving patients on stretchers through smoke and dust-filled hallways. NBC News has not independently confirmed the details of these videos. And this morning, the U.S. National Security Council reacted to the operation at Al-Shifa, telling NBC News, quote, "We do not support striking a hospital from the air, and we don't want to see a firefight in a hospital where innocent people, helpless people, sick people trying to get medical care they deserve are caught in the crossfire." It all comes as a senior advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu said there had been no firefights inside the hospital itself.
I can tell you so far inside the hospital, there have not been firefights between our forces and the terrorists. We have discovered weapons and other things. We entered the hospital on the basis of actionable intelligence. Hamas, as you know, and as has been announced by the administration in Washington, by the White House and the Pentagon, Hamas uses the hospital as a shield for its military machine. And what we're trying to do is deal with those Hamas targets and safeguard, of course, the civilians who are using the hospital.
Meanwhile, the White House is confirming it has its own intelligence supporting Israel's claims that Hamas uses hospitals, including Al-Shifa, and tunnels underneath them to support their military operations and to hold hostages. All this as Israel's broader military operation in response to last month's Hamas terror attack continues, with Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking to troops in Israel, lauding their efforts and pledging to continue what he called Israel's two tasks, eliminating Hamas and bringing hostages home, saying, quote, "There is no place in Gaza we will not reach." Joining me now from Israel is NBC's Aaron McLaughlin in Tel Aviv. And Aaron, we know Israeli troops are inside the Al-Shifa hospital, but what else do we know about what's going on inside that hospital complex?
Well, what we can piece together at this point, Garrett, is limited. It's very difficult to reach anyone inside of Al-Shifa Hospital. We've been trying all day. In just the last few hours, we were finally able to connect to the head of the Al-Shifa's burn unit, but he said that he was only able to paint a limited picture because he is constrained to the main surgical building in the Al-Shifa complex. He said that he can't leave the building. He He said he's limited in terms of his movements because there are Israeli drones in the area, Israeli snipers surrounding the building. He can't get out. And then also communication within the building is limited because the landlines within the hospital aren't working. They have limited cell service and they have no internet. So what he describes in terms of this raid is last night at 11 p.m., a rocket, he says, hit the 4th floor of the main surgical building. He said that luckily none of the patients were injured as a result of that rocket fire, but everyone was terrified. And then at 1 in the morning, the Israeli military contacted the director of the hospital to notify them of their intention to enter the hospital. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Everyone felt really terrified and felt scary of what's happening there, and we didn't know why this is happening. You know, imagine all kinds of weapons used. The tanks are all around the hospital, which started like 6 days ago. So they all around the hospital. The snipers are all around the hospital. At 1 o'clock early morning, they called the administration and told them they are planning to go in Al-Shifa hospital and to get into the building, and they asked for cooperation between them and asked the people to cooperate with them.
Now, the Israeli military, he says, asked the director of the hospital to accompany them to tour the basement. The director then asked for the presence of the ICRC and the United Nations to facilitate that search. The Israeli military declined and then searched the basement anyway, and then also removed some patients from an adjacent dialysis center, bringing those patients out of the hospital. He said in total he saw 10 Israeli military soldiers inside the hospital itself, and he says that it's not clear to him if they're still inside of this hospital. Garrett.
And Aaron, Israel also said it would allow UN aid trucks to refuel at the Rafah crossing today. What do we know about the latest on the distribution of aid into the Gaza Strip?
Yeah, well, the fuel situation inside of the Gaza Strip right now is desperate, according to any number of humanitarian organizations. Today, the United Nations confirmed that 20,000 liters of fuel were allowed to go through the Rafah crossing, but that is only 9% of the overall needs within the Gaza Strip. They said that there is a serious lack of water. According to the United Nations, clean water, 70% of Palestinians living in Gaza right now do not have access to clean water because that fuel is needed to power the desalination plants. Also, the hospitals relying on that fuel. And because the Israeli military is limiting the fuel, that 20,000 liters that they did allow into the Strip today just to aid distribution, those other needs simply aren't being met. And humanitarian organizations say the situation there in Gaza is approaching, quote, catastrophe. Garrett.
All right, Aaron McLaughlin, thank you for your reporting, and please stay safe. Joining me now is Lieutenant Colonel Amnon Shefler. He's a spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Forces. Lieutenant Colonel, the IDF said this afternoon that the operation at Al-Shifa was still ongoing. I guess my first question is that still the case? And what degree of control does Israel now have over the hospital complex itself?
Garrett, thank you for having me, and good evening. We are acting inside the hospital in a very precise way based on intelligence in a very small part of the hospital where we have already found clear evidence of Hamas using it, like they use other civilian infrastructure. They use schools and UN installations, and also the hospitals, like we have seen in Rantisi Hospital, in Al-Quds Hospital, and now also in Al-Shifa Hospital. This is, of course, a war crime and a sickening behavior to use the ill and the patients and the staff as human shields. And that is why we need to meet the goal that we have put forward to dismantle Hamas so that they can't carry out these heinous acts again and again.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically about what kind of evidence you found and whether that evidence points to hostages being held at any point at the hospital as well?
So we found in the last few days in different hospitals, I mentioned specifically the Rantisi Hospital, where we saw that potentially hostages were held. We've been saying for weeks asking civilians from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to move to the southern part where it's safer, and similarly also from these hospitals that are used as the bases for Hamas to carry out its terrorist activity.
But I'm asking about Al-Shifa specifically.
So what we found today is evidence that they use that. In the MRI room, we found AK-47s and other weapons and other equipment of military use, and also in the other corridors in the same facility within inside that hospital. And we're continuously acting to find more. What I was saying is that for weeks, we've been asking the hospital and civilians in the region to move to a safer area. And that's why we also know that Hamas is already taking whatever it could out of those areas. And still, we need to go after wherever they are acting and wherever they can be acting in order to dismantle it. And more importantly also is to bring our hostages home, the 239 Israelis and other nationalities, that this is the day 40 that they're still held hostages in Gaza.
I want to talk about the hostages in 1 second, but I have one more question about the hospital specifically. When this targeted operation is over, is the goal for that hospital to continue to be operational, or to be operational again, I guess, depending on how bad you think the situation got there? Or are you trying to get folks out of there to other facilities? How will that be handled?
Yeah, generally, we're trying in the best ways to facilitate and to allow humanitarian needs to be met. We're doing this specifically within the hospital. We offered fuel to the hospital, putting our officers and soldiers in risk, bringing fuel to the hospital. We brought this morning incubators so that we can help out with that. We have said that specifically the eastern part of the hospital will continuously be an area that people can evacuate from. We are, as mentioned also before, giving fuel to UNRWA like we did today in the crossing. And we're also inviting any international aid that can come and build field hospitals in the southern part of Gaza and transfer it in any way that we can help the innocent people that are in Gaza. Our war is not with the Palestinians in Gaza. Our war is with Hamas, that launched this war on the 7th of October in a horrific massacre that killed over 1,200 people and kidnapped 239 that are still being held hostage in Gaza.
In the little bit of time I have left on the issue of the hostages, a diplomat that spoke to NBC News talked about this idea that if Hamas is pushed too far, they may feel like there's nothing left to lose. How do you balance the military activities of the IDF in the Gaza Strip with searching for these hostages and not wanting to potentially take any action that might negatively affect the negotiations that are going on for the hostages' releases?
We have two clear goals for this war. One is to dismantle Hamas, and second is to bring back the hostages home, safely home. We're doing this in all different ways. We're doing this militarily, diplomatically, intelligence-wise, in any way that we can in order to reach these goals. I must remind all, the safest and the easiest way for these hostages to get back home is for Hamas to release them. And we expect the international arena and anyone who can to continue pressure Hamas to doing so.
All right, Lieutenant Colonel Shefler, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And as we mentioned, President Biden is currently meeting with Chinese President Xi in the San Francisco Bay Area on the sidelines of this international economic summit with Asian Pacific leaders. That high-stakes meeting, which is now in its second hour, is the first time these two leaders have met, let alone talked, in a year. And in the course of that year, relations between Washington and Beijing have come under immense strain, including the U.S. shooting down that Chinese spy balloon earlier this year and multiple close encounters between the U.S. and Chinese militaries in the South China Sea. Here's some of what the two leaders had to say at the start of this meeting.
Mr. President, we know each other for a long time. We haven't always agreed. Actually, it's not a surprise to anyone. But our meetings have always been candid, straightforward, and useful. I value our conversation because I think it's paramount that you and I understand each other clearly, leader to leader, with no misconceptions or miscommunication.
For two large countries like China and the United States, turning their back on each other is not an option. It is unrealistic for one side to remodel the other, and conflict and confrontation has unbearable consequences for both sides.
For more on what we can expect out of that meeting, I'm joined now by Monica Alba in San Francisco and Bonny Lin, director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Monica, how will the White House judge if these meetings have been successful? Are there deliverables that we expect to see?
A couple, Garrett, and the president actually put out a baseline for how he views success in this meeting yesterday. And there are a couple of areas. Probably near the top of the list would be the resumption of military-to-military communications. That's something that totally broke down after then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan more than a year ago. And that is something that both sides have likely agreed upon at this point, that some of the close calls in recent months, when we're talking about the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, the fact that these military leaders can't pick up the phone and talk to one another is a real concern. Perhaps when this was most problematic was, of course, when the U.S. shot down that Chinese spy balloon in February of this year. So reestablishing those kinds of communication channels is paramount. And you saw there from those remarks from both leaders that there could be, quote, unbearable consequences if some kind of a smaller skirmish or issue mounted to something larger in the form of any kind of military conflict. They don't want to let that get to that point. So reestablishing those kinds of military communications is a real key deliverable that they expect to have come out of this. And then there are some other more obvious areas of cooperation potentially. There could be a joint working group on addressing fentanyl, specifically the fact that these chemical companies in China produce some of the drugs that then go to Mexico, are mixed with other substances, which become fentanyl-laced other kinds of drugs and opioids that are then smuggled into the United States. That's an area where I think we can also see some kind of potential progress, but there are plenty of other very thorny, intractable issues on the agenda that there might not be real progress, but overall the U.S. will say the fact that these two leaders are sitting down face-to-face, having these conversations is a real significant moment in this diplomatic relationship that really has had a lot of issues in the last year, Garrett.
A lot of issues and a lot of behind-the-scenes maneuvering to even get to this point. Monica Alba, thank you. Bonnie, you just heard Monica outline some of the expected deliverables here, including this possible announcement on fentanyl. I was in a press conference with Chuck Schumer, who seemed to suggest that he thought that was a sort of a definite thing that was going to come out of this. But this does kind of feel like low-hanging fruit. When you don't talk for a year, the idea that you might continue talking after you talk is pretty basic, right?
That's right. So aside from fentanyl, mil, another deliverable that we have seen, or outcome we have seen, is cooperation on climate change, particular agreement on both sides to invest more in renewable energy. I do think that, though, that neither side is going into this meeting expecting major outcomes. Part of it is that both sides want to stabilize relations as we may be moving into a relatively potentially rocky year in 2024. 2024, we are expecting the results of Taiwan's next presidential elections in January. And depending on how that election pans out to be, it could be one in which Beijing might want to, or might feel like it needs to, escalate against Taiwan. We're also expecting the U.S. presidential election in 2024 to potentially introduce more uncertainty in U.S. China relations. I think China is fully expecting that as the U.S. presidential election heats up, that President Biden, as well as Republican leaders, will potentially embrace more rhetoric that is about competition with China. And China is not going to like that at all.
China has some unsteadiness in its own government, too, right? I mean, they don't have a defense minister right now. The Chinese economy has been weaker than it has been traditionally. Talk a little bit about the position Xi finds himself in domestically coming into this meeting. What are the Chinese looking for out of it?
Sure. So I think yesterday, President Biden may have said, I don't have the exact quote, that China does face some difficulties at home, exactly like you mentioned. Economically, China is experiencing a number of challenges, including the difficulty in attracting foreign investment. We are seeing record rates of youth unemployment. At the same time, on the foreign policy side, China recognizes that some of its activities on its periphery, as well as with other countries, have led to pushback. So Xi Jinping is coming to this meeting expecting that the optics will look very good for him. I think one of the reasons why he is interested in meeting with CEOs after the meeting with President Biden is, for example, to make the pitch to U.S. corporate leaders, hey, invest in China. So hopefully he hopes to leave this meeting in a better position than he had when he came to these meetings in the United States.
You mentioned foreign affairs. Obviously, there are two wars going on right now in which Iran is kind of a major figure behind the scenes. The Chinese have some influence with Iran. Is that another area we might expect to see the president and Xi discuss, the Chinese using their influence on Tehran?
I think definitely that will be a topic that President Biden and his team will mention to the Chinese. I doubt we will see significant movement there just because China, first of all, has been very reluctant to really step up in the Middle East, but also because I don't think the Chinese believe that they actually have that much leverage over Iran. Most of their leverage is on the economic side, and the Chinese don't want to present themselves to be similar to the United States in the Middle East in terms of using its leverage to tell Iran what to do. I think in some ways that is a little bit irresponsible of China, but that is how they view their constraints in the Middle East.
Very interesting stuff. Bonny Lin, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
And coming up, taking on Trump, President Biden slams his likely 2024 rival after former President Trump compared his political opponents to vermin who pose threats within the country. Plus, in the clear, the Senate is set to vote tonight on a short-term plan to fund the government with just 2 days to go until the deadline. We're live on the Hill and a busy day for Congress next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back on what has also been a busy day on Capitol Hill. In the Senate, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's office signaled this afternoon that they had secured an agreement to vote tonight on that stopgap measure to prevent a government shutdown, which passed in the House late yesterday. And over on the House side, FBI Director Chris Wray warned lawmakers that violence in the Middle East is raising concerns about potential attacks on the U.S. during a hearing on threats to Homeland Security.
In a year where the terrorism threat was already elevated, the ongoing war in the Middle East has raised the threat of an attack against Americans in the United States to a whole nother level. Since October 7th, we've seen a rogues gallery of foreign terrorist organizations call for attacks against Americans and our allies.
My colleague Ryan Nobles joins me now from Capitol Hill. Ryan, these worldwide threats hearings are always fascinating. What was the biggest takeaway from today's edition?
You know, Garrett, there was no doubt that the two secretaries that were part of this, Secretary Mayorkas from the Department of Homeland Security and the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, wanted to really make it clear to these members of Congress that we're living in a very scary time, that there's a real possibility that something could happen as it relates to several of the conflicts around the world, but some of that could end up right here in the United States. But to be honest with you, that did not seem at all to be the focus of many of the Republicans that participated in this hearing. Instead, they chose to use it as an opportunity to try and express some sort of political vendetta, many of them spending time talking about the prosecution of the January 6th defendants, suggesting wild conspiracy theories about the federal government's involvement in the January 6th attacks, which has been largely discredited, and not really focusing on the substance of what Director Wray and Secretary Mayorkas were there to do. So there was certainly a lot that they talked about that was of the substance that was very important, but it's also an important reminder that there are many that are focused on a lot of things that in the grand scheme of things do not appear to be all that important.
A House hearing light on substance. Bring me my fainting couch. Ryan, I can smell the jet fumes from here. Any word on when the Senate will vote on this CR and get out of town?
Yeah, so we know that both the Republicans and the Democrats have done the process called hotlining, where they send out the potential pieces of legislation to be voted on to get a sense of where things stand. That's usually the last step before they actually bring something to the floor and vote on it. It does appear as though they're going to vote on an amendment by Senator Rand Paul in exchange for a time agreement that would allow them to speed that process up and doing it as late as tonight. To answer your question as specifically as I can, though, we don't know exactly when that is going to happen. We're in a bit of a holding pattern now, waiting to see that process played out. My guess is they're counting votes on this hotline to see if there are any issues in passing this swiftly. So the vibes we're getting is that we should still expect it tonight. The exact timing of it, though, is still up in the air.
It wouldn't be a possible shutdown without a possible last-minute Rand Paul storyline. Really quick, we are waiting on an ethics report at George Santos that's supposed to come out before the end of this week. Any news on when we might see that or what might be in it?
I mean, it could come at any time. It could drop tonight. It could drop tomorrow, maybe even Friday. But we did learn something very significant about it today, Garrett, and that is the chairman of the committee telling us, Congressman Michael Guest, that there will not be a specific recommendation from the Ethics Committee as to how to handle the information that they've uncovered into their investigation into George Santos. It's not uncommon for the Ethics Committee to release a report and then say, this person should be censored, this person should be expelled, this person should receive no punishment. They're not going to do that this time around, which leaves open a wide range of possibilities as to how Congress could potentially handle this specific ethics report. Keep in mind that gaggle of New York Republicans who have been calling for his expulsion for a long time are only going to make their voices louder once this report comes out. So we'll have to see how Speaker Johnson handles this once we actually see the report.
The congressional choose your own adventure in December, probably, when they're fully back. Ryan, thank you for your reporting. And up next, Senator Joe Manchin meets the press. The West Virginia Democrat sits down for a wide-ranging interview with our very own Kristen Welker as he weighs a potential presidential bid after announcing his retirement from the Senate. Kristen will be here to break down the biggest moments and what they mean. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Meet the Press moderator Kristen Welker sat down today with a lawmaker that a lot of people have questions for right now, West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. Manchin, of course, recently announced he's not running for Senate again next year, leaving the door open for a presidential run. And he isn't being shy about his criticism of President Biden. Kristen pressed him on that potential run.
Are you seriously contemplating a run for the White House?
Here's what I'm seriously contemplating. And I've said this very clearly, but people always want to say, well, are you going to run? I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure and mobilize that moderate, sensible, common sense middle. That could be a center left, center right. So it could be a person who is involved in the grand old party forever. But they basically say, well, you know, my Democrat friends over here, the old blue dog Democrats, the middle's gone. There's not many of us centrists left. And if I can reinvigorate that, and I said, I will do everything that I possibly can. I'm totally, absolutely scared to death that Donald Trump would become president again. I think we will lose democracy as we know it. And my reason for saying that, you can't normalize this visceral hatred, calling people names and attacking people. You can't basically think the only fair election is the one you win. And the only laws pertain to everybody but you. That's not the country we are. That's not how we became the country. And I'm afraid that Joe Biden's been pushed too far to the left. Can he come back? We'll see. But the bottom line is that's not the Joe Biden that we thought was being elected, to go that far left.
Just to clarify, just to put a fine point, I know you haven't made any decisions, but are you considering running for president?
I will do anything I can to help my country.
Is that a yes?
And you're saying, does that mean you would consider it? Absolutely. Every American should consider. If they're in a position to help save the country, I think we're on the wrong course. So I will do everything possible.
You've said you don't think you would be a spoiler. If you look at the polls, it shows that a third-party candidate would take support away from President Biden. What do you say to those who say you would be a spoiler?
I've never been a spoiler in my life of anything, and I would never be a spoiler now. But
if you ran as a third-party candidate?
Everyone's saying it's going to spoil and tip the scales one way or the other. Okay, you have basically Ross Perot. Who would have predicted that Ross Perot would have elected Bill Clinton, tipped the scales to Bill Clinton? I don't think so. Who would have predicted that Bobby Kennedy now, with his support, would tip the scales for Donald Trump, or hurt Donald Trump, I'm sorry. and tip the scales to Joe Biden, since he basically left the Democratic Party. No one can predict these things.
As you sit here today, do you think President Biden and Vice President Harris are the strongest ticket to represent the Democratic Party in 2024?
Not in the centrist part, no, I don't. And they know how I feel. I do not believe that they are basically where Joe Biden has come from. And just go back to the campaign. He's been here for long. He understands the system. And I think he's a good man. And we have good conversations. We just disagree. You're going too far left. I can't go there.
Do you think he should run for re-election?
Well, that's up to him to make that decision. I'm not going to make anybody's decision for him.
You heard Manchin say there that he won't be a spoiler for President Biden, but he also did not hold back on his fears about what a second Donald Trump term in the White House would mean for the country.
What would a second Trump presidency mean to the country?
I know. I speak for myself, okay? Taking that type of visceral approach to everything that's sacred, everything that's made us, we're not perfect. The Constitution said a more perfect. We're trying to be more perfect. And we've been trying for a long time. This takes it to another level, to it just destroys everything that we've built to now. And I'm just scared to death that it would basically, as we know democracy, you can't publicly tell someone that if I get reelected, I'll use the power of my office for revenge.
And joining me now is the moderator of Meet the Press, also the regular host of this program, Kristen Welker. Kristen, you spent a lot of time with Senator Manchin today. What sense did you get about where his head is on this? Is his heart in the idea of running for president? Like, how does he really see his political future?
It's such a great question. I don't think his heart is in it yet. I think he is in a listening and contemplating moment. You heard him there say that, yes, he's thinking about it. I think what he's doing is traveling around the country, talking to people, listening to people. He doesn't think there is enough focus on the center of the country. He's concerned about the two extremes of each party. And essentially his message is that the middle is getting lost. And so I think he's trying to gauge how much energy and enthusiasm there would be for a third party candidate and whether that's realistic. Obviously, recent history shows that third party candidates don't do too well.
And they're not good for incumbents.
That's exactly right. They're not good for incumbents. It was notable that he pushed back so forcefully on the idea that he would potentially be a spoiler. But I did drill down on him, or I tried to, Garrett, on the ways in which he thinks that President Biden has moved too far left. Here's what he had to say. Now, you have said he goes too far left. What makes you say that? What specific policy
or legislation?
Well,
basically, I can talk about energy because it's to the point now. We want to bring everything back to America, all the building blocks. Now, whether it be electric vehicles, things of that sort, that's fine. But let's make sure that we can support ourselves in doing it. We're producing more energy today than we ever have. You don't hear this administration talking about energy security. We're producing 4.6 billion barrels of oil, 37 trillion cubic feet of gas, and also we're doing more wind and solar. You can walk and chew gum in America. It's the United States of America.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. The U.S. did have its best drilling month of the year last month.
You know how hard that's been to get that done?
Does the president deserve some credit for that?
Well, yeah, they had to let it happen because we forced it in the bill. We wrote the bill to where you have to have a balanced approach. You never hear the administration talking about energy security. You never hear the administration talking about we paid down $230 billion of debt. But yet our debt's running wild at $33.7 trillion. If we don't get our debt under control in the next 10 years, we'll be spending more to service the debt, the interest on the debt, than we will on anything else we spend money on. I think that basically he is not talking about the things he's done that really protects the middle, the things we did in bipartisanship, the intentions of the bills that we did and how they were enacted. You cannot implement a piece of legislation you didn't pass. I'll give you a perfect example, is the Inflation Reduction Act. Not once have you ever heard it was an energy security. We're producing more energy. That bill forced us to produce more energy because you know why? Putin declared war on Ukraine and he used energy as a weapon and put all of our allies in Europe at peril. We had to produce. We weren't able to help them. We started producing. That's when I got involved and we started writing the IRA bill and $35 for basically insulin. letting Medicare negotiate for lower prices, bringing in more oil and more natural gas. We brought the price of gasoline down. Inflation was 9% when we passed it. We're at 3.3. But that's the middle. But you have to play to the far left because that's where they think the base is.
So, Garrett, just to boil it down, Senator Manchin's basically saying President Biden should spend more time talking about these bipartisan pieces of legislation that, by the way,
I
Senator
voted for
Manchin
and that we did together.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. He notably said, I said, when are you going to make this final decision? He says, by Super Tuesday. So he sees that as his hard deadline. I also pressed him, though, on his decision not to run for re-election in West Virginia, because a lot of Democrats, as you know, you talk to folks on the Hill, say he was the best chance for Democrats. The only chance to hold on to that seat. He said, look, he thinks it's very likely that that seat will ultimately go to a Republican. So we'll have to see what happens. But you do get the sense that he denies that he had concerns about losing and that was a part of his final decision not to run for re-election. But the political reality is that he was facing a real uphill battle.
A very difficult race.
Yes.
I noted the Ukraine flag pin on his lapel. If there's going to be a deal on Ukraine aid, Israel aid, he's probably going to be in the middle of it. Did he make any news on that topic?
He did, Garrett. He was very bullish on that topic. He said he thinks that Israel and Ukraine aid should be linked. He talked about the importance of not backing away from defending Ukraine as well. Obviously, there's a growing call within the Republican Party not to write a blank check for Ukraine. He said it's equally important to continue to fund Israel, but also Ukraine as well. And he wants it tied to border security. He said he thinks they can get it done by the end of the year, but expressed some disappointment and frustration with the fact that it wasn't linked to this CR that Congress is voting on.
All right, Kristen Welker, thank you for bringing that interview in, and I look forward to seeing more of it. The stuff we saw was great today. We'll see more over the next couple days, and then Sunday, I imagine. And after the break, President Biden compares the former president's campaign rhetoric to Nazi Germany, what it says about the state of our politics headed into 2024. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. President Biden took some time during his California swing to slam some recent remarks from his past and likely future election rival, Donald Trump. Referencing remarks from the former president over the weekend, Biden said, quote, in just the last few days, Trump has said if he returns to office, he's going to go after all those who oppose him and wipe out what he called the vermin. It echoes language you heard in Nazi Germany in the 30s, and it isn't even the first time. A spokesman for the former president called Biden's comparison despicable. Trump's vermin comments are just one recent example of dark and aggressive statements and proposals that the former president and his allies have been making less than a year out from next year's election. And just like in 2020 and in 2016, we expect this rhetoric to be a focal point of the 2024 campaign. Joining me now on set is Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, as well as an NBC News political analyst. Democratic strategist Amisha Cross, and Jim Garrity, senior political correspondent for the National Review and a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. And Peter, I'll start with you. I mean, the president went right after this vermin comment in California. Is this an answer to the pleas from some on the left to take on Trump more directly as part of this campaign?
Yeah, there has been a frustration on the part of a lot of Democrats who think that the positive message about Bidenomics hasn't been working. His number is still in the tank. These polls showing him tied or even worse with President Trump, in their view, demands a more aggressive strategy, and that is to draw the contrast. If the theory of the case is you can't convince voters to vote for Biden, then you have to convince voters to vote against Trump. And one way of doing that is by calling him out on rhetoric like this.
Amisha, is this exactly what President Biden needs? He talks all the time about the alternative versus the almighty. He's got to start hammering the alternative. The almighty's sitting this one out, as we've been talking about.
Absolutely. And I think that, this kind of landed in his lap. This is a president who didn't want to go and attack Donald Trump forwardly as much as I think he would have had to bolster people to get excited about this election. The other thing is Donald Trump is still far and away ahead of everybody who's running against him in the Republican primary. Even though we saw the election results of this past Tuesday's race, at the end of the day, there's still an upset amongst Democrats who are like, hey, how do we get our people out for November? That is the biggest question. Next November is a huge question. And this president has to showcase not only his strength, but also the fact that Donald Trump is dangerous. And he's dangerous because he has authoritarian leanings. He's dangerous because he models himself after dictators. He's dangerous because he doesn't believe in democracy.
Jim, does this work in a Republican primary? Is this what Republican primaries want to hear from primary voters want to hear from their candidates?
I don't know. I don't know if Donald Trump cares if that's what people want to hear. That's what pops into his head. That's the way he feels about people who have the audacity to dare criticize him. One thing I wonder about, I don't know if this will work for Biden in the sense that, did you know Donald Trump says crazy, outrageous, incendiary things? We've been seeing this since he came down the escalator in 2015. You wonder if this is priced in. Now, maybe not everybody hears every particular comment, and there might be people say, oh, my God, that really is terrible. But I think most people know what they think of Donald Trump by now.
But this has had an impact in the primary. I mean, you wrote about this, right? Tim Scott doesn't talk this way. Tim Scott's not a presidential candidate anymore.
Yeah, roughly half the party since the very beginning of this campaign has decided, yep, let's roll with Trump again. And nothing has really changed other than maybe the indictments which made Trump's popularity go up. And if you want to criticize Tim Scott, you can. He certainly didn't, take off like a rocket. I think it was at like 6-point-something% in Iowa when he dropped out. It wasn't anywhere in New Hampshire or South Carolina or anything like that. But it's not like anybody. It's not like DeSantis or Haley are nipping at Trump's heels. Everybody's down by like 20 points.
Right.
So of that other half of the party that might be interested in something else, they're not unified behind any other option.
Is this the own the libs mindset as a political campaign base, Peter? I mean, is this, again, sort of like the idea that Republican primary voters want this? Is this another one of those things that, yeah, but when we get to the general election, it'll be different? Or is Jim's point solid here that this is so baked in now, it just doesn't matter to your kind of like standard voter who just expect Donald Trump to talk this way?
Well, it is baked in. Obviously, people do know what they think of Donald Trump. And the people who are bothered by this were probably bothered by him before, right? That's obviously the case. The people who like him look at this and think it's kind of, they like it. It's refreshing. He's brassy. He's bracing. They appreciate what they see in his authenticity and his willingness to get out there and take things on. And he wants us to be talking about him.
Right.
He says provocative things to get the kind of reaction that he's seeing, because then it's a cycle and he dominates the conversation all over again. But I think it's also important to talk about these things and where they come from. People, enemies of the people, the phrase he uses about us, people like us, that's a Stalinist phrase. I mean, he has been using language like this from the beginning. He knows it's language that is associated with history's worst actors. He doesn't mind that. It's okay with him because he gets the juices stirring.
Amisha, I think the fear among Democratic strategists, or the concern that I would have if I were sitting in that seat, is that this doesn't cut both ways in the sense that, yeah, Biden can rally people around some of Trump's language as it turns people off. But if it turns you off to the point you just don't vote or turn off your TV and say this politics thing is gross, as opposed to getting you fired up to go elect the other guy, it doesn't work. How do Democrats capture that disgust and use it and not just watch it push people out of the political discourse altogether?
Well, he's got to do two things here. And I think that what we heard from Peter was actually correct in the sense that everybody knew who Donald Trump was already. None of these things are new notions. He's been somebody who's been on an authoritarian slide. He's been somebody who mirrors dictators. He's been somebody who's drawn inspiration from Mein Kampf. We know who Donald Trump is. However, what Joe Biden has to do is showcase what that type of trajectory looks like, not only with January 6th, because January 6th didn't move people in the way I think Democrats believed that it would.
It helped in the midterms.
It helped in the midterms, but it's not something that people are voting on right now. The other thing he has to do is showcase what he has done since he's been in office, because the president has done a seismic amount of work when it comes to policies passed that the American people can feel, but they're not translating in the way that I think the people on his campaign, as well as those within his administration, expected. So on the one hand, he's got to attack Donald Trump where it hurts. On the other, he's also got to show what have you done for me lately to the people on the ground.
It was funny because I thought about this during the Joe Manchin interview. I hope you guys were all able to hear it. Manchin's complaints about Biden's policies, which he voted for, don't appear to be that the policies were too far to the left, but that the president's not selling them as Joe Manchin would. Right. Is there another lesson to be learned here from Joe Manchin if you're Joe Biden, Peter, to go out there and talk about energy security, not the sort of greener elements of something like what's in the Inflation Reduction Act?
Well, Manchin's got a point that the president doesn't talk about certain elements of his program or priorities for the American people that he thinks are going to be damaging to him. He doesn't talk about immigration very much, even though it's a seismic, to use your word, concern among a lot of voters, not just voters on the right, but a lot of people even in the middle. You're hearing Democratic mayors and governors of northern states talking about it. You won't hear Joe Biden talk about it, and there are some things he gets brag about and then some things he would have to defend. Same thing on energy, I think.
I didn't hear anything in Joe Manchin's voice that made me think this is a guy who really wants to go run for president. It might be somebody who wants to be president, but the kind of, MRI for the soul, you got to go out there and fight for it every day. I didn't hear that there. Did you?
I didn't, but there's two thoughts I'm going to thought. The first is that you saw that New York Times poll where Robert F. Kennedy Jr. gets thrown in as the third option. Yeah. And he's getting about a quarter of the vote in like 6 swing states. It's really kind of surprising. That to me doesn't say the country is really sick and tired of vaccines and stuff like that. That to me says Trump, Biden, what else you got? Who else you got as an option there? And I think that Manchin should look at this and say, okay, are you going to win? Probably not. But you could be H. Ross Perot. You could be an independent candidate who really gets the biggest chunk of the vote in like a generation. Maybe you want to do that. And the second thing is that I heard in Joe Manchin's voice was Joe Manchin's voice. In the sense that, like, this guy is like only 8 years younger than Biden, but he looks and sounds and feels like a guy who's still on top of his game and coherent. Like, we're going to have Trump 4 years older and crazier, and Biden 4 years older and looking it and showing it and sounding it. So what does Joe Manchin have to lose in a situation like this?
It's a good question. I want to ask you about one other internal Republican issue here, and that is, what is Vivek Ramaswamy doing? Which I don't mean in a broad sense.
I'm the wrong person to ask.
No one has so much time. But I mean specifically about this idea of going after Ronna McDaniel and the RNC chairmanship. Does he want that job? Is he doing a reverse Buttigieg, run for president first to then help you be a party chair on second?
Maybe try the Dick Cheney. President Trump, I will help you find a better RNC chair. I've done my review. I am the better RNC chair. That's sort of like, I could see that because, like, the funny thing is, Romney McDaniel, what a terrible choice. Who put her there? Right. Well, Donald Trump did. Like, let's not kid ourselves.
Amisha, last word on this. I mean, would Democrats welcome either one of them in the chair as we head into 2024?
Absolutely not. But I think Vivek's a whole lot scarier than Ronna McDaniel. Now, there's questions about the fact that she just loses again, and anybody with that record of losing that she has should be gone. But Vivek is not the one to call balls and strikes here. He's crazy.
Okay, well, we have to leave it there. Peter, Amisha, and Jim, thank you all for that conversation. And folks, do you know where you'll be on January 23rd? Because I just found out where I'll be. We've got a 2024 election update for you after the break. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. New Hampshire's Secretary of State David Scanlon announced this afternoon that New Hampshire's primary will be held on January 23rd, officially bucking the Democratic Party's plan to put South Carolina at the front of their primary calendar. This move ensures New Hampshire keeps its historic status as the first primary in the nation, but the state will face punishment by the DNC for not following its new order. At a press conference today, Scanlon had some pretty strong words for President Biden and the Democratic Party officials who have argued that more diverse states should instead go first.
We did not take the first of the nation primary from anyone, and we will vigorously defend it. Using racial diversity as a cudgel in an attempt to rearrange the presidential nominating calendar is an ugly precedent. At what point does a state become too old or too wealthy or too educated, or too religious to hold an early primary?
NBC News White House correspondent and former New Hampshire embed Mike Mamley joins me from Concord, New Hampshire. So, Mike, obviously, not much of a surprise, but it really does set the Biden campaign and the Granite State on a collision course.
Yeah, it really does, Garrett. And you laid out my most important credential, which is that I spent a lot of time here in 2008. I've come back here every presidential cycle since then. And I've seen the battle that New Hampshire has to wage firsthand to keep its role at the front of the nominating calendar under Secretary Gardner and now Secretary Scanlon. And this time, though, has felt very much different. There is a bit of more direct confrontation here, and you saw that in Secretary Scanlon's announcement today. He was saying that New Hampshire believes that it is the voters who should decide who the nominee of the party is, not the elites in Washington or in the party. And that really is a direct rebuke to what the president and his team has ordained here by rewarding South Carolina as you do. The staging of this event was so fascinating as well. Secretary Scanlon was standing in front of flags that were carried into battle by New Hampshire soldiers during the Civil War in, you guessed it, South Carolina.
Subtle.
And now it was interesting, the lack of a response from the Biden campaign and from the DNC DNC today, but they did send their own sort of preemptive shot just a few days ago. I was on Air Force Two with Vice President Harris for what was a last-minute decision to send her, rather than just having Jim Clyburn bring the paperwork. It was Vice President Harris who presented the paperwork to the South Carolina Democratic Party chairwoman, saying this is for the first-in-the-nation primary. So this is a much more direct confrontation, and the question is, what does this mean for Democrats down the road? Republicans are sticking with their traditional order. Iowa will be first, then New Hampshire, followed by the states to come, and ultimately Super Tuesday. There is concern that the Democrats now are somewhat divided over how to handle this decision by the president not to be in the ballot. Do they support, for instance, a write-in effort that might not necessarily succeed? Do they just stay out of the primary altogether? And this is an important state because, as Al Gore will tell you, the 4 electoral votes that New Hampshire brings to the table might be the margin of victory next November, and Democrats here are somewhat divided over what the president has done.
Yeah, can you push that butterfly effect a little bit further out here? Because that's what I'm interested in. People forget that New Hampshire is actually a very competitive state, despite the fact that it has been blue more recently. Are New Hampshire Democrats mad enough or divided enough about this that it really pushes New Hampshire kind of back up the list of battleground states in the fall, do you think?
One of the things that's really going to be interesting to watch is what do other Democratic surrogates do ultimately next November. We might see people like Pete Buttigieg, like Wes Moore, like J.B. Pritzker, Gavin Newsom volunteering to campaign in New Hampshire on behalf of Biden, knowing that the 2028 calendar might look differently. All
right, Mike Memoli, thank you. I'm sure you'll be all over it. And thank you all for being with us this hour. Kristen's back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.